Good evening, everyone. On a warm Wednesday in September, my name is Eugene Moy. I'm president of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and we welcome you to the beginning of the fall season for the Historical Society. We've been doing this for the last 47 years, and we're proud to really share with you an outstanding program involving an outstanding group of young people, and we're going to hopefully have a great evening. And if you have a chance, hopefully join in with some of the Q&A. Just one item, we want to let you know that this meeting will be recorded. If you happen to miss some or all of it, you can certainly come to the Historical Society's YouTube channel and find the recording of tonight's meeting, as well as all of the prior meetings that we have had over the years. I'm not going to talk much today, except to let you know that we have some nice meetings coming up, but I'll talk to you about that at the very end. For tonight, we have a great group of presentations from some of our summer interns. They are headed by a team of distinguished scholars led by Professor Will Gao from Sacramento State, Kelly Fong from UCLA, and Isabella Xianglong Quintana from UC Irvine. I don't need to go into their qualifications. You can go to our website and learn a little bit about their individual areas of scholarship. Suffice it to say that these are some of our young leaders in the academic community who have either published or served on our board over the years. And we're very proud of the fact that we are continuing the legacy of doing good research and sharing good history. LA Chinatown has been around for more than 170 years. And there are many, many, many stories. And some of our students will be sharing some of those stories with you tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Our team will be monitoring the chat for questions, and at the end of the presentation, we will be responding. Of course, we also have some set questions that we'll be asking. But in the meantime, we want you to enjoy, absorb, and think, because a lot of this history that we collect really adds a great deal of dimension to what was previously known. And we're very pleased and honored to be able to work with some young scholars who will be able to share what they have heard and what they have learned. And we hope that that will inspire you to do your own research on your own families and your own communities. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Isabella Quintana, and we'll get started. Isa?
Thanks, Gene. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's really thrilling to be able to celebrate community history work actually with our community. And so this is just the perfect way to do that. So as Eugene said, my name is Isabella Xianglong Quintana. I'm one of the 5 Chinatowns project coordinators with Dr. Gao and Dr. Fong. We are really, really proud of the work that our interns have done this summer. So it's really my pleasure to introduce our project and our interns tonight. After the interns speak, there will be time for question and answers, a Q&A. Please use the chat function at any time during the presentations to ask your questions, and we'll go through them. We'll, collect them and go through them at the end. When it comes to Los Angeles Chinese American community, there's a striking gap in the literature of urban Chinatowns, especially in the period before 1965, when the 1965 Immigration Act was passed. And this is widely known as the Chinese exclusion era, and I'll say more on that in a moment. However, Chinese American history is US history, And our community, our stories, our histories deserve to be documented. And as Jean started to talk about this earlier, but one of the things that he said when he came to visit our intern meeting that just has stuck with me so much is that it's not just that these histories are important, but these histories are just to know, but these histories help us to make better futures, right? They sort of help us to give us something to build upon and to strategize upon for our collective futures. So oral histories have become, they've become so vital in the telling of our stories and expressing our experiences. And that is exactly what our interns focused on this summer, was to, each one of them did an oral history interview with one of our community elders, and we did some training, and I'll let them talk more about that, but in a little bit. But let's see, next slide, please. Okay, so you might be wondering what is the 5 Chinatowns? What are they? Like, you know, so many people don't know that there were 5 Chinatowns in Los Angeles. Many people, even in Asian American studies, don't know that there were 5 Chinatowns in Los Angeles. And part of that is because there is so little history of Chinese American Los Angeles before 1965. One of the things that makes Los Angeles Chinese American history very unique is the 5 Chinatowns, but also that Chinese Americans in Los Angeles, from the beginning of their arrival in this city, which was then a dusty frontier town, from that moment, they were part of a multiracial community. And so that's something that's, you know, is true of other urban spaces, but in Los Angeles, there was much more sort of segregation wasn't quite as rigid in that way, but it was Chinese people were segregated from white people, but not necessarily from other people of color, sort of depending on the circumstance. So the 5 Chinatowns that we're talking about, it starts with Old Chinatown. And to give you some background, Old Chinatown is where the Chinese first settled in Los Angeles, which is along Olvera Street Plaza, which was then the heart of Mexican LA. And Old Chinatown existed until the 1930s. It grew and grew to several blocks, many vibrant businesses and vibrant communities, children, right? Like lots of things were going on there. It was like, you know, it was a Chinatown. And that community, as many of you know, was destroyed with the building of the Union Station depot, train depot, and with the later on with the building of the 101 freeway. So the second, we could go on and on about this, obviously, but the second Chinatown is the area near City Market. So that would be around like 9th and San Pedro Street. If we think about now, it's like further south into what we think of as downtown now. And that was an area where there was the City Market where people actually did sell produce. Chinese community sold produce, but there was also a lot of people that lived around in that area. And so that became, when we kind of think about another sort of a cluster of like Chinese American community. So that's a second Chinatown we're talking about. The third is China City, which only existed for 10 years. And it was created by Christine Sterling, who also created the Olvera Street tourist zone. But despite the fact that it was, you know, kind of a Hollywood idea of Chinese people and Chinese things, there were actually Chinese Americans who lived there and whose lives actually challenged those kinds of stereotypical ideas about Chinese people. And the fourth one, New Chinatown, that's what we think of as Chinatown now. And that was founded in 1938 after Union Station, and then that community was kicked out. So New Chinatown was founded in 1938, and it's the area that we currently know as Chinatown. And then our fifth one is East Adams area. which is the area near the intersection of East Adams and South Central Avenue. Many Chinese Angelenos moved there so that they could, a lot of them were able to own homes in that area. They were not allowed to own homes in other places because of redlining and racial covenants and all of these kinds of practices of segregation. Those are our 5 Chinatowns. And we, around this project, we are putting together a book anthology. And the book takes a place-based approach. And what we mean by that is that our focus is on centering the locations where people lived, where they worked, where they played on a daily basis, and also how Chinese Angelenos understood their lives in those places, right? So we focus on the period of exclusion, as I said before. It's the years when the United States federally barred Chinese laborers from legally crossing its borders. The Chinese exclusion era, we most often hear the Chinese exclusion era talked about as the period between 1882 and 1965. Although it's important to note that the Page Act in 1875 actually barred Chinese women from entering. So arguably that might be the first, but that's a whole other scholarly argument to make. The book includes authors who are authors that are students, they are community members, they are community historians, professors, scholars of all kinds, and it highlights oral histories as well as other kinds of archival materials. But oral histories we found to be the most important for us to know about the Chinese American community in Los Angeles, and probably anywhere in the United States. So we anticipate that the book will be published in 2024, and it will be published by the Asian American Studies Center Press at UCLA. We're very, very excited to be working with them. And this, am I on the next slide yet? Oh. I'm sorry, I'm losing my slides here.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Wait, where was I? Oh, okay. So the book, as I said, is very important to us because we're working in partnership with the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, and their press is going to publish our book. But also because it builds on this work of so many who've worked on these kinds of things before us. And specifically, we're talking about the Southern California Chinese American Oral History Project, which was done from around 1978 through 1981. And that collection was the pivotal collection for my dissertation and continues to be for my book. So I think that that's just been just a really important, and we would go to UCLA, and I have my son is saying bye. Good night. And so that has just been really important. And we went to those archives and sat at these giant tables and listened to tapes and pressed play and rewind and play and rewind over and over again. But it was so worth it because we got to hear the voices of our communities and be able to write about them. And the second is Linking Our Lives, the Chinese American Women of Los Angeles. This book was published in 1984 by several of the authors who were a part of the Oral History Project. And this book is a really seminal work for Chinese American history in Los Angeles. It's one of the only ones, even still. And it focused on women, which is just amazing to me because there's so little focus on women even now. So this is a really, really important book. At least 2 of the authors are going to be authors also in our anthology. But we see ourselves as sort of building upon Linking Our Lives as our book is sort of an homage to Linking Our Lives. The third project is the Chinatown Remember Project, which was done in 2007 to 2008. And that was mostly was Will Gao, who conducted that. And those are, very, very important collection for folks who are doing this research and wanting to know about it. So these are 3 fantastic collections of Chinese American histories, and we would not know much about anybody without them. So the Chinese Historical Society is working in partnership with the UCLA Asian American Studies Center on this. And so it's which is exactly what happened before with Linking Our Lives and the Oral History Project in the 70s and 80s. So, all right. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our interns. They're going to share a little bit about what they learned from the project this summer. Each of them will introduce themselves and talk about the person that they interviewed and what it was like to do that. And we'll start with Fionn.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Fionn. I'm a third-year student at McGill, and I'm pursuing a joint honors degree in history and philosophy. So I walked into this project expecting that my lived experience as a Chinese Canadian would possibly give me some point of connection to our project on Southern California's 5 Chinatowns. But since I don't often get the opportunity at McGill, which is all the way in Montreal, to engage with Asian American history in an academic context, well, because we don't have any Asian Canadian or Asian American studies programs here anyways, I also came in here ready to learn immensely from my fellow interns, supervisors, and community elders. So this summer, as you can see on the slide, I conducted and transcribed 2 interviews with Robert Louis. In our interviews, Robert, through his nonchalant humor, shared anecdotes about City Market, Tin Can Beach being mixed race, the class disparities he noticed as he moved around different neighborhoods, the Watts protest, his childhood in New Chinatown, the Cold War, and his service in Vietnam. And I'd say that the advantage of oral history and what I found myself being most attentive to were Robert's personal stories that overlap with these macro global events that are debated over ruthlessly among historians. And my narrator's accounts were a unique exploration of the past. So Robert also reflected on his experiences being both white and Chinese in these changing contexts. Right from the get-go, he emphasized how the 1943 Interracial Marriage Act was integral to his family's history. And at 54th Street and La Fuente High School, he was the only Chinese kid at school. And being mixed, he felt that he didn't belong to either side, but he was in a sort of limbo. And Robert came of age when LA's beaches were racially segregated. And without making any explicit note of this context, he recalled a fond memory of grunion running with his cousins at what they would call Tin Can Beach, seeing that it was littered with rusty tin cans and you would never dare to step onto the beach barefoot. He also lingered on those class differences between Castlar and 54th Street School. And upon moving to 54th, his teachers had lectured his class about these poor, unfortunate people in downtown LA and the importance of donating toys and canned food to them. And to his surprise, he realized his new school was the donor of the toys and cans he'd received at Castlar for the holidays. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the project itself. This project has acquainted me with the radical and empowering method of oral history for Asian American studies and the historical study of groups that don't seem to quite fit into the grand narrative of American history. And while you can read as much theory on history as you'd like, this summer, I've also gained a more concrete idea of how to be a more responsible historian from our project's co-directors in my own research. And where do I see these skills fitting into my future plans? I've been floating around the idea of writing an undergraduate thesis on queer Chinese Canadians and integrating that oral history component. But if for logistical reasons, I can't explore this topic as a thesis, I hope to continue this project with the local Chinese Historical Society, because this is a matter of personal importance that shouldn't be relegated to academia. And I study history not because I'm solely interested in the discipline as an abstract theoretical concept, but as my colleagues have modeled this summer, out of a love and care for my community. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you all are having a wonderful night. My name is Stephanie Hu, and I'm originally from Orange County, California. So I'm currently a freshman at Harvard University studying sociology and art history, and I've had the privilege of being on this internship the past few months. So I came into this internship with the intention of not only developing my skills as a historian, but also to learn more about the history of a city that I've lived so close to for the past 5 years, and by extension, learn about the Chinese American history at large. Next slide, please. So in an effort to do this, I had the privilege of conducting an interview with Marilyn Chow Tom. So Marilyn was born on November 14th, 1927 in Selma, California, as her family's third child. Her family moved to Seattle, Washington for much of her childhood, but when she was 13 years old, Marilyn's family moved to Los Angeles, where her father opened a store to sell tea and ginger. And growing up, Marilyn recalled really fond memories of her and her sisters wrapping tea and ginger for her father's businesses. Marilyn attended Hollywood High School, and some of her favorite classes then were her art classes, which really allowed her to explore knitting, collaging, printmaking, and sculpting. And she's still an active artist today. Something else about Marilyn was that she attended UCLA as a physical education major from 1945 to 1949. And after graduating, she had the opportunity to teach sports at various high schools, universities, and churches, most notably at Long Beach City College. Next slide, please. So now that I am at the conclusion of this internship, I do have a lot of reflections and thoughts regarding this incredibly valuable experience. I think first of all, something that really stood out to me about Marilyn was her openness in talking about the discrimination and prejudice she endured in college and after college as well. So Marilyn told me a story of how when she was in college in the 1940s, she wasn't allowed to join sororities because she was Asian. And after graduating college and after getting married as well, she told me stories of how she would try to rent an apartment in Los Angeles in the 1950s, but how she would show up at different landlords' properties only to have the door slammed in her face upon seeing that she was Chinese. And both of those experiences, she said, really hurt her. Those stories, I think, gave me a lot of insight into the importance of oral history. So in my history classes in high school, I had vaguely heard about these incidents of discrimination, but I think Marilyn's personal story really humanized this history and gave light to the emotional turmoil that she, as well as the rest of the Chinese community, endured. So for other things that I learned from this internship, it gave me very valuable oral history experience and taught me how to be a better historian and researcher. It taught me the importance of centering marginalized voices, and taught me skills on how to interview, ask the right questions, how to conduct research, and try to transcribe interviews as well. So moving forward, I hope to continue my passion for documenting Chinese American history by pursuing a minor in East Asian Studies. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Miriam Chen. I'm a current third year at Texas A&M University, and I'm double majoring in international commerce and history. Next slide, please. I had the privilege of interviewing Miss Dory Wong. She was born on September 19th, 1934, and grew up in Los Angeles. Her father was an entrepreneur in New Chinatown, so he was a founding member of the Chinatown Corporation and opened the Golden Pagoda in the United Meat Market. And so as a result, Miss Wong interacted with and knew a lot of people from around town, and she always emphasized a strong sense of community within Chinatown. She had 9 siblings and had a level of independence that was rather unusual. She would tell me stories about riding the streetcars alone, carpooling to school with her friends, and running errands for her mother around town. And like many others, she also attended Castlear Elementary, Nightingale Junior High, and Beaumont High. And she had, during this time, she always emphasized time and time again the racial diversity she was surrounded by. So she had friends of Hispanic, Italian, Japanese, and Jewish descent. And she said that despite all these racial groups, there was never much tension or prejudice in school. which really contrasted with the attitude a lot of people held towards Asians during World War II. And so I think it was evident through these experiences that Ms. Wong was extremely accepting and open-minded. She studied education at UCLA and worked for 44 years as a teacher and later district administrator in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And so I think her background and experience growing up as a child of immigrants really enabled her to better understand children in the same shoes as her in the environment that they grow up in. And so she was able to take her experience and make an impact by implementing multicultural and bilingual education programs. So she really was a lifelong learner. Ms. Wong also served for 6 years as the principal of Castler Elementary, where she was once a student, and it was really heartwarming to see her go full circle and give back to the community that she grew up in. So to reflect on the past 10 weeks, next slide, please. This internship was actually my first experience with oral history. I've also never taken a class that focused on Asian Americans, and ethnic studies isn't really a thing at my school. So this internship was really eye-opening and a great learning experience. So I'd like to extend my thanks to Ms. Wong and the professors for guiding me along the way. This project taught me how to conduct oral history, but also how to treasure it, because only the narrator can tell their story, which makes it really special. Even though the narrators, sometimes the narrator felt like their anecdotes are insignificant, but it really contextualizes events and adds a personal layer that's often missing when people learn about history. And so I think it's really important, and oral history is a great tool to generate a fuller image and gain firsthand accounts when it comes to research. I think the conversations Ms. Wong and I had about race and diversity particularly sheds light on the importance of ethnic studies. I grew up in a pretty diverse area, but now I attend a predominantly white institution. So this project has really allowed me to see how ethnic studies and multicultural programs benefit students, so that younger generations can have a space to have conversations and learn about their heritage and identities growing up. So the opportunity to hear from Ms. Wong and the rest of the internship cohort was invaluable. And I personally learned a lot by interacting with community elders. And so moving forward, I hope to introduce something similar at Texas A&M, where I'm involved in a movement called the Asian American Studies Initiative that essentially pushes for more Asian American courses in education. And I was really inspired by this project to implement discussions with community elders or just members of the community to hear about their experiences and learn from them through interviews and Q&As. So that's something similar to oral history that I wanted to bring to campus with the goal of educating students on minority experiences and just spreading awareness. So all in all, I want to thank everyone who made this internship possible, and it was a really great learning experience. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Rue, and I'm currently in my last year at the University of Michigan. I'm a double major in history and American culture with a minor in ethnic studies. So yeah, that's definitely why I kind of got into this internship, even though I'm actually not from California. I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, but I still think it is very relevant. So next slide. So I had the privilege of interviewing Barbara Samura. She was born in LA in 1947, and she lived in New Chinatown, but she only lived there until about age 6 or 7, where her family actually moved to Riverside Drive. But she told me many stories of how she spent a lot of time in Chinatown visiting her aunts and her cousins, and how they would just have the freedom to run around and just kind of get to know the people that own the stores there, and just the celebrations they would have for like Chinese New Year's. She just had a lot of really fond memories of that. And she would just go on to explain how some of the best memories she had was actually going down with her middle school friend, or her childhood friend, when they graduated middle school, to just really have just the freedom to like explore together. And in her interview, there was just a lot of different things that popped out at me, and those important things were, one, generational history. A lot of what she talked about really connected her past to where she is right now. As a resident of California still, she mentioned how she went to school at Nightingale, but she also went back to teach there for a good amount of years. And while she was there, she actually expanded the cultural impact. She brought in activities for Chinese New Year, and brought in activities for Cinco de Mayo too, as a home economics teacher, and she really spearheaded that for a really long time. She also explained about the Chinese Benevolent Association that she and her family were involved in. And as she's grown older and her cousins have grown older, they continue to be involved. And just really initiate events with the association, like picnics and banquets. So it just goes to show how through her stories, we see those connections of where they are now and just what she had in her childhood too. And just, yeah, the importance of community is just always there. So yeah, like moving forward, I think I really was able to see just the importance of oral history and research. It is such a unique part of research that I feel like doesn't get a lot of, I guess, like like not a lot of people do oral history, I feel like nowadays, but there's just something so intimate about being able to talk to these people in our community, and there's just so much that they have to share, even when they don't think they do, that really you can see connected to the greater history of the area. And a bit more generally, Barbara talked about just immigration and seeing these first generation Chinese Americans coming and like starting up businesses, and just how their families like were able to have greater education for their kids and kind of send them off a bit. But even just having those businesses, whether they were restaurants or gift shops, it just goes to show how important labor was to Chinese Americans, and how that actually translates to a lot of different Asian American groups too. Just when they first come to the US, like just having that labor force and that community together in a place like Chinatown is just such a driving factor. And it's just so important to, I think, Asian American history as a whole. And I think zoning into that history for Chinese Americans and in Chinatown, which I think we have the most of as of right now, just really goes to show just how important it is just for the whole. But yeah, I think those were some of the bigger things I learned through this internship, and just hearing about it from other people too, like my other cohort members. I'm just so grateful for this chance, and that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Liu. I am a current third year at UCLA studying double major in public affairs and Asian American studies with a minor in global health. I'm really excited to be here today to share y'all basically the story of Catherine, also known as Kathy Chan Seppi. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So a lot of you, maybe some of you may know Catherine or Kathy as the current CEO of the Phoenix Bakery, which is just down the street from the Historical Society. The Phoenix Bakery has acted as a landmark of downtown Chinatown in Los Angeles, California since 1938, when they opened in Central Plaza. I'm deeply grateful to have been given the opportunity to interview such an incredible woman who has been there since the business's early days, and listening to the incredible stories she has to share about her family. One of the things I find most admirable about Kathy is her love and dedication to her family. She paints these stories of determination and perseverance as her family sought to make a name for themselves. For example, one of the stories I found most interesting about her family is about her father, Feng Chao Chen, and his involvement within the community, specifically his obtainment of a bank charter to start Cathay Bank and East West Savings and Loans, which ended up creating a lot of financial avenues for other Chinese families in Los Angeles to be able to navigate a Caucasian-dominated space. However, he had to deal with a lot of racial discrimination, as Asian Americans were not allowed to hold bank charters without white colleagues. But despite these requirements, he acquired Caucasian partners and fought against those who refused his acquisition of a bank charter. A lot of the stories that Kathy shared with me were heavily involved with a lot of the relationships she shared within Chinatown. For example, her relationship with her father and how he was friends with Gilbert Leong, which allowed Kathy to also be close friends with his daughter, Leslie Leong, as well as being sister to Kellogg Chan, Ken Chan, and Kelly Chan. Oftentimes, a lot of her stories were defined by others. And one of my struggles when it came to Kathy's story specifically is that her story involved the stories of many other historical figures that came from Chinatown. During the beginning of our internship, we read a book called Linking Our Lives, as we highlighted it earlier in this presentation, which explored women's history in Chinatown and how their networking connections with one another allowed them to make space to grow in a Caucasian male-dominated society. But Kathy and many women like her are typically portrayed as just merely witnesses to history in other instances of history outside of Linking Our Lives. Like Kathy, women were reared to just be providers and supporters, but I believe that's what sets their stories apart from other points of history. For Kathy, she didn't just work at the bakery and act as caretaker for her younger brother and perform all of the household chores just to stay on the sidelines in history. She did it because she had a familial duty to support her family and because she cared for them. And she did this while making top marks at school and going to USC for occupational therapy, where she ended up later pursuing research for 45 years afterwards. And in fact, without her and her mother, the Chan family probably would not have survived, since Kathy also likes to note that her brother's inability to perform chores and washing the dishes around the house ended up making that her responsibility and her mother's. Her love for her family was so enduring that she made sure that her family got what they needed. Even until this day, she lends her home to her family whenever they need it. And I think her continuation of the Phoenix Bakery business is a tenement to her love for her family. This is not to say that women should stay and perform these roles, but to make sure that when we're writing women's history, we're acknowledging those stories that we may not deem as important, because all stories are important to history. This internship and many other parts of ethnic studies and history are so important because it gave me personally the space and tools to think critically on how I approach sharing stories like Kathy's and how she fits within the rest of the Chinatown community. I hope to be able to incorporate these tools of community storytelling into my goals of hopefully working within nonprofits and community organizing to help advocate for better representation of the Asian American community. I want to also thank this internship, as well as the rest of the audience, for providing me this space to share the story of the only daughter of the Chan family. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylani Kokia, and I'm currently an incoming master's student for the 4+1 program in Asian American Studies at UC Irvine. I'm currently pursuing a degree to pursue a career as an ethnic studies educator. And as someone who grew up in LA, it was really interesting to be able to learn the deeper history of Chinatown, a place that I often went to during the weekends with my family, and also learn the personal histories in this space as well. And of course, I had the incredible honor and pleasure to interview Miss Joanne Young for the 5 Chinatowns project. So next slide, please. So Miss Young was born in 1951, and she was the youngest of 3 daughters. She was born at what was formerly known as the French Hospital in LA Chinatown. And growing up, she lived in the same house right next to the Pasadena Freeway, only a couple blocks from Chinatown. And alongside her 2 older sisters, Joanne was raised by her mother, Doris, who unfortunately had to raise her 3 daughters alone after she became widowed during her last pregnancy with Joanne, when her husband passed away. But despite these hardships, Miss Young told me about how her mother remained strong and dedicated to her daughters. She told me of these special memories she held with her family. She said it was a lot of fun with like having all girls growing up. So they used to drive out to like the latest shopping centers, spend all day shopping, go on family trips or even special trips to theme parks with their cousins during birthdays. And then every day, Miss Young would often typically join her mother at their family's businesses, the China Cafe in Grand Central Market, and later the Chongqing parking lot. At school, Miss Young attended all of the local schools, Castelar, Nightingale, and Belmont, and where she was able to form a close childhood friend group with 5 other girls, and they remained close friends all throughout grade school and are still friends to this day. So next slide, please. And in my interviews with Miss Young, I noticed the key themes I noticed were women as active makers of history and the relationships that women create in order to create community. So first, just highlighting women as active history makers, Miss Young told me a lot about her great-great-grandmother, Dr. S.K. Chan, who was the wife of Reverend Chan Sing Kai, a well-known Canadian Chinese minister, and how her great-great-grandmother was actually a suffragette and led a Chinese American suffragette society. So pictured there is Miss Young's great-great-grandmother. And then also just highlighting the special relationships that women create with each other. Even though I interviewed only Miss Young, she shared with me a lot of stories about her relationships with her mother, and also a very special relationship that she was able to form with her aunt later on in life. And by telling me these stories, I was able to learn about these women's stories as well. And it really highlighted the significance in the everyday experience of women and how like their relationships with one another were able to provide like community support during difficult times. So next slide, please. And lastly, just in reflecting on my experience in the internship, I've previously done oral histories in other classes during my undergrad, but this internship was definitely the most comprehensive training I've received in oral histories. And also the first time I was really able to do like in-person oral histories, which was a really special treat. And then as for how it'll tie into my future plans, my time in the internship really revealed to me just how powerful oral histories can be in just learning about the personal, everyday experiences of people. I've been reflecting a lot on what it means to curate community history, asking questions such as, how do we challenge the dominant voices that have long written history, and what it really means to truly create a people's history. So this experience has really like helped me deal through these questions. And as for like my own like grad research, I plan on focusing on transnational Filipina activism with an oral history component. For those of you who are familiar with the political situation in the Philippines, it's really revealed the value in telling these personal everyday histories, with the Philippines in particular right now dealing with a lot of historical revisionism. It really shows the danger of what happens when these histories aren't told and when these stories aren't passed down. So thank you everyone in the internship, my fellow interns and our mentors, and just everyone who has supported this program. And of course to Mrs. Joanne Young. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ishan Liu. I'm a recent graduate from UC Berkeley, where I studied Asian American and Ethnic Studies. And I currently work for the Asian American Journalists Association. I'll be presenting on the oral history interview I conducted with Mr. Gilbert Hom. Mr. Hom was born in 1950 and had 3 brothers. His father was a paper son from Toisan, China, while his mother was born in San Francisco. After being drafted into the army during World War II, his father returned to find hiring discrimination in industry jobs, so he took a job as a butcher. He then met Mr. Hom's mother at Wing Chong Long in Old Chinatown in Los Angeles, which I've included a photo of here. And Mr. Hom's father later became a plumber and was the first Chinese American plumber in the Plumbers Union. His father was also a member of the Chulan Association, which I've also included a photo of. And Mr. Hom remembers growing up in the area around what is now Koreatown, and told me stories about ruling over table golf with his brothers after school and going to church services at the Chinese Presbyterian Church in East Adams on Sundays. He recalled the layout of the city market Chinatown and details like the noodle factory, optometrist, markets, and cafes. And later he attended UCLA and got involved with the Asian American Studies Center before dropping out to become an activist and organizer in Chinatown, participating in ways such as forming a youth organization there. So while telling me his story, Mr. Hom told me a lot about his mother. So I wanted to share some anecdotes that he told me about her and how she attended 3 or 4 church services every Sunday just to practice her Chinese. She wasn't particularly religious, but she was incredibly kind and came home after those services with dim sum for the family. She also gave rides to other Chinese women who didn't have cars. And on top of all of that, she made sure that the family ate brown rice every day to stay healthy, which he credits for being able to live a long life thus far. I really enjoyed hearing Mr. Hom's story. At the beginning of this internship, having had prior experience in transcribing and conducting oral history interviews, I've heard so many narrators say that their lives are unimportant and not interesting. And I hope that I was able to express to Mr. Hom how much his story meant to me. As this internship concludes, I've been reflecting on how these stories still resonate in the present day. And I hope that all of the narrators of the Five Chinatowns project were able to see how their stories are very interesting and help to paint a fuller picture of the history of Los Angeles Chinatown that has been historically left out of the narrative. I was also able to gain a real sense of community that's difficult to get from just looking at photos or reading textbooks about the diaspora. And one of my biggest takeaways from conducting this oral history interview was that people's stories have meaning, no matter how small or disconnected they might think they are, and they do touch other people's hearts. So I'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello, everybody. My name is Annalise Harlow, and I am a recent graduate of Sacramento State, where I received my bachelor's degree in sociology with a minor in Asian American studies. I've been very fortunate to return to Sacramento State this fall to work full-time as an administrative coordinator in the ethnic studies department. And hopefully in a few years, I'll be able to pursue a graduate degree in Asian American studies. I had the great pleasure of interviewing with Mr. Al Suhu. Next slide, please. And together we were able to have 2 interviews, and I really learned a lot about the importance of oral history and storytelling just from interviewing with Al. So during our interviews, I think what was just the most amazing thing to me was seeing how vibrant and alive oral history can really be. And it was just amazing to be able to witness how Al is able to reconstruct like history in our minds, you know, even if we've never been there and we're born like 50 years later or so. It was just really amazing to see, to kind of like get to see it all as he was speaking. And I think that was really just a huge like awakening for me to realize just how important oral history is for how we account history in general. One of my favorite stories that Al shared with me was when he was a young kid, he would help out at his parents' gift store, which was called South China Gifts, located on Jinling Way. And as a child, you know, as young as 6 or 7, he would sit on top of the counter while his parents were working in the back. And then when customers would come in, he'd yell to them in Chinese and they'd come out and conduct the business. And I just think that was a really great story. And I do know from what he shared that a lot of his peers shared similar experiences growing up in Chinatown, and specifically Central Plaza where he grew up, that of, you know, having a family business and then living in the back of the store. Al, like many people of his generation, attended Castellar Elementary School, Nightingale Junior High, Belmont High School, and then later he attended UCLA. Next slide, please. So what I've learned from this internship about oral history and just, you know, Los Angeles Chinese history in general. Well, this was my first experience with oral history and it was really impactful. Hopefully, you know, I would like to apply what I've learned with oral history to my own research, which is concerning Chinese American adoptees and international Asian adoption, which I was which is my research interest. And then as far as Los Angeles Chinese American history, I'm actually from the Sacramento area. And so learning about the Los Angeles community was so interesting, especially because I live in a predominantly white area. And so getting to read and like learn from Al and my peers about what it was like growing up in such either a racially diverse area or in the enclaves of, you know, Chinatown, it was just really interesting to me. And so I would just like to end by saying thank you to Al Suhu, who is here in the audience. So thank you for coming today. And then as well as everyone else involved in the internship. I learned so much from all of you. So thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Vi Trung and I recently graduated from UCLA with my bachelor's in psychology with a minor in Asian American studies. I was able to have this experience as the recipient of the Stanley Kwok Lau and Dora Wong Lau Scholarship offered by UCLA's Asian American Studies Centers. And I am so lucky to be returning to the center as their program assistant this fall with their work in the API Multimedia Textbook Project. This summer, I was fortunate enough to meet with and interview 3 of LA Chinatown's community members. Next slide, please. So Lily Robinson was my first narrator, and I am so grateful we were able to arrange an interview together early on in the internship. I really could not have asked for a greater first experience with oral interviews, and Lily was so generous with her time, stories, and invitation into her home. Lily Kwan Robinson grew up in New Chinatown and lived with her parents, older brother, and 2 younger sisters. She expressed appreciation for her working mother and older sisters and thanked them for her smooth adjustment in a more racially diverse school setting. Even though she experienced the tragic loss of her father and brother when she was really young, the memories she shared with me revolved around her good feelings and unique experiences with her friends and in her neighborhood. I think even when Miss Robinson shared her racist encounters with others, whether it was at parties or in public, and whether it was directed towards her or her interracial marriage, she did not harbor resentment or hostile reactions. Instead, she sympathized for their ignorance and explained to me their lack of experience and exposure had manifested into such prejudices. But when you get people to learn, you can change their attitudes. Miss Robinson really is such an amazing woman because when we're talking about the 40s to 60s, her attitudes towards others who were different was much more open-minded and progressive than what we would expect. That said, my conversations with Lily taught me that oral history connects past and present and creates a never-ending shared story in which we don't only look back on the past for lessons and to be in amazement of how different people's lives were, but also to see where today's norms and ideals started from. With my experience with Miss Robinson, I learned that for the preparation of future interviews, you can always start with a commonality between you and your narrator because starting from a middle ground can prompt for stories that you would have never started. Because for me and Lily, even though we grew up in entirely different communities at different points in history, we were still able to share laughs about being immature in elementary school, disbelief about others, prejudice and nostalgia over snacks served during Lunar New Year. And as much as I learned about the sights and attractions of China City from Lily's eyes when she ran around and saw the nightclubs and dancers, which was interesting to see how children were able to roam freely and safely back then as compared to now, I was able to better understand where she was coming from through her sharing her perspectives on incidents with other school children or when she unintentionally found her cousin working in civil services. So while I do think it is important that history is explored through the facts, it is just as meaningful and insightful to hear about the individual anecdotes and really get to know the voices that lived through the time and in the area. Next slide, please. So I also got to interview Theodore Ng, and despite the difficulties of having our conversations through Zoom, Mr. Ng was very patient with me and followed up constantly with information that helped to contextualize his childhood for me. Mr. Ng came from a humble background but took his life into his own hands after high school when he enlisted in the Vietnam War and continued with his military service as a state guard for New York and then going into consulting and programming before he retired in Nevada. Mr. Ng quite literally went out of Chinatown to see the world and get experience with people of different backgrounds, which is reflected in his familiarity with over 6 languages, French, Spanish, and German, to name just a few. I think what I learned from my interview with Mr. Ng is that while history can paint a picture that maps people's life by their economic status, everyone's life is ultimately different and can change regardless of certain limitations or advantages they start out with. If we don't do oral history, we risk the possibility of generalizing everyone living in a certain period or under a certain financial privilege or struggle. Mr. Ng's story is an excellent example of that. Though his father was a butcher and his mother was a housewife, and Mr. Ng was more or less living a mixed experience between his Chinese and Caucasian side, he broke out of that frustrating early life. While history books do mention the displacement and rough experiences of interracial children, we rarely hear about the stories and details and how they navigate their identity in daily life. Mr. Ng provided me a glimpse into that when he shared how, as school children, when fights broke out, his Chinese side would be targeted by the white and Hispanic kids, while his Caucasian blood was pointed out by his Chinese peers. And while this was a racially rooted experience that seems to draw a negative interaction between interracial groups in Chinatown, Mr. Ng also shared how his pregnant mother was once given a Chinese dish when she visited the Chinese-owned grocery store, despite her being normally outcasted in the neighborhood for being white. Next slide, please. And last but of course not least at all, I interviewed Wilbert Singh Toy Liu, who I was a little intimidated by at first, but came to know him as such a kind personality and evidently a mentor figure. The way he led his life from his childhood into his career and the way he takes care of his family is incredibly admirable, and it seems to stem from his father, who led his life too. Mr. Liu's father, Tony Kwan Liu, and family were important figures in Chinatown, and they ran many of the businesses that were featured along Spring Street, such as Man Cow Cafe, Singley Theater, and International Grocery Store. Outside of juggling the responsibility of these business ventures, Mr. Liu's father helped others in the community with starting their businesses and sponsored family members from the old country as well. While it seems like the family had a lot on their hands, Mr. Liu followed a routine that reflected his discipline and work ethic. He went from school to Chinese language school to helping out his family business. After high school, he, like Mr. Ng, went into the army and served. This work ethic and respectable reputation followed Mr. Liu into his career as he became one of the few Asian Americans serving LA County's fire department and the first Chinese fire captain in LA County. Though having to prove himself on a predominantly white task force, Mr. Liu navigated his 34 years of service admirably. Now he continues to give back to the community and fire department through his volunteering and mentor role for the upcoming generation of young firefighters, his son being one of them. Mr. Liu was so generous with his time and knowledge with me and continued to answer my questions and meet with me to go over our transcripts even after our 2 interviews. My experience with him and working on all the material was that oral histories are waiting for us to uncover and engage with them. I always had the impression that the hardest thing about interviewing someone was being able to find someone who was willing to spend time and open up about almost any question they are asked. I realized, especially through talking with Mr. Liu, that people want to share their stories for the sake of preserving the history of their families and ensuring that we don't forget where people started and came from. When it comes to oral history, the general misconception is that it is biased and therefore not a valid and reliable source. However, oral history not only supports the standard research and presentation of historical timelines and facts, but connects past and present generations with real voices and anecdotes. Reading background texts and even quotes in my Asian American Study courses did provide me adequate knowledge on the stereotypical circumstances a person or family lived during a time. However, when conducting my interviews and hearing how different life was for each person, even though all of my narrators shared a childhood in LA Chinatown and in the period before 1965, each of their experiences could not have been any more different. Aside from their Chinese roots, every other aspect from their family dynamic, socioeconomic status, and daily routines diverged from this one commonality. No matter how dense or descriptive my textbooks were, they could never fully capture the different personalities and livelihoods of everyone living in the LA Chinatown area, which is why I was really surprised and quite taken aback from my very first interview how different my narrative lived from what was portrayed in my studies. History is so full of nuances that we can only uncover through primary sources, oral history being one of the most informative sources in my opinion. The voices of oral history share unique memories that sentences and graphs on a page cannot, and tones reinforce attitudes of which words on a PDF cannot so easily convey. With the technology we have now, recording voices and videos so that we can capture these expressions like nostalgia and disbelief will only make oral history more accessible in our everyday consumption of history. Thus, it is so important and urgent to understand the importance of oral history because it is a limited resources, and those voices need to be heard and stored before we miss out on the stories and people that shaped our communities and contributed to local and national legacies. Thank you.
So thank you so much, all of our interns. It's so incredible just hearing all of you, all of your presentations, and it's been a real honor working with all of you over the course of the last few months. If folks could right now, I want to remind you, if you're out there in the audience, if you have questions, please take a moment to put them in the chat. I'm going to begin by asking a few prepared questions, but then after that, we will be switching over and hopefully taking a few questions from the audience. So please take a moment. If you have some questions, put them in the audience. I believe we've got 1 or 2 that are there already, but if you have more, please go ahead and put them out there. All right, I'm going to start off by asking our interns. I want you to think back to when you were in high school. And I'm just curious, what have the types of history we have documented here the way I'm curious about the ways in which the types of history we've documented here in the 5 Chinatowns project have differed from the types of history that you encountered in grade school as you were growing up. I'll let any of the interns unmute themselves and just go ahead and answer that question. So how the types of history we documented here with 5 Chinatowns differ from the types of history you encountered while you were in school?
I'm happy to share. So how it's differed this summer is definitely, like I said earlier, I grew up in a really predominantly white area. And so what I remember in grade school and even up to high school, it was just a very white history. And you know that I didn't even really know of any other Chinatown outside of San Francisco, which is kind of embarrassing, but it's also very true. And it says a lot about the focus of our education for history and what we consider to be history. And so with that said, it also didn't include any oral history or any personal accounts to even support what they were even saying. And so this summer has really taught me that history looks like a lot of different things. And, you know, I'm probably biased now, but I definitely believe oral history is one of the most important ways that we can document history. And so, yeah.
Not biased at all, Annalise. I think it is definitely one of the most important ways we can document history. Other thoughts for interns on that same question? How did the work you did here for 5 Chinatowns differ from the type of history you encountered in grade school or middle school or high school?
Echoing what Annalise was also discussing with like it also being like a very like white history that was told in school, I think also the few like times that like Asian American history was told in my history classes, from what I remember, it really focused on like these big events or even in particular like laws kind of. So yeah, it focused on like those like really big events and not necessarily like the very like personal and like individual experiences of these actual like big events on people. So I think oral histories, they're one of their most like powerful like components is just how humanizing they are and understanding these bigger events. Yeah.
Yeah, so could you just say a tiny bit more about that, Kehlani? Like how, like when we think about, you're saying that it helps us understand them in different ways.
Right. So
yeah,
like with like the personal impacts, I think I'm trying to think of like specific examples. Well, like for example, with like the like housing laws and stuff and segregation laws that those are like talked about in history, but then when you add in like the oral histories, it helps people understand like what that actually looked like for people if you're not familiar with that history. So my narrator, Miss Young, told me about how one of her uncles, her aunt and uncle, like they actually were able to like buy a house in Silver Lake, but they had to go through it like secretly through a friend. So I'm assuming like presumably a white friend that they had bought the property for them, and then they secretly like bought the property from him, and that allowed them to like build the house and stuff, because during that time, you know, they weren't selling to Chinese families.
No, I mean, definitely, I think this idea of like, I mean, I think what you're speaking to, or at least what I'm hearing, is like this idea of the way in which oral history gives us this sense of agency, right? We can understand the agency of like everyday actors in a way that when we study just laws, or, you know, if we're studying things like redlining, in the case of what you're talking about, those things don't really come through often, right? I'll have one more intern. Is there one more intern who'd like to answer the question, how have the types of history we documented here in 5 Chinatowns differed from the types of history you encountered in school? Is there one more person who'd like to kind of build on that? And then I'll turn to some questions we got here popping up in the chat.
I can go ahead and something that like I want to like emphasize on Kehlani's point on just like these like large events. I think something else that like at least like for me, with my experience of history from like high school and grade school and all that, was that it was very largely emphasized on like numbers and statistics. We don't get like specific stories or like how maybe these laws impacted these specific people. They just said like, oh, like this many like Chinese Americans got moved because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. They only said this many like Chinese Americans existed in this area, but they don't actually say specifically like what we're telling now through these oral histories of like the stories that we can get from these individuals. And again, like it's sort of like this dehumanizing factor of like taking away the fact that these people are people in history.
No, thank you. So it's kind of like adding up this, you said dehumanization. So like oral history in a sense adds a type of humanity back to history in a way that's often lost, certainly in high school history textbooks. I totally agree with you, with Sonia. So I'm going to turn now to a few of the questions we have in the chat. Tony Kong wants to know, during your interviews of your respective community members, did you see a difference for those that were raised mostly in Chinatown with versus those that were raised outside of Chinatown? And Tony gives this as context. Tony says, I took my first Asian American Studies class from Professor Su-Cheng Chan at UC Berkeley in the early 1980s. And I still remember her explanation of the differences of growing up in Chinatown, who were those folks who were mostly poorer and socially and culturally more isolated, versus those Chinese Americans who moved outside of Chinatown and were often wealthier than their Chinese American neighbors in Chinatown. So did any of you, we were interviewing folks that grew up in these 5 Chinatowns. Did any of the interns, any of you see a difference between these stories and stories maybe that you'd heard of other people growing up in Chinese American suburbs, perhaps like Monterey Park?
Yeah, I can speak to that really briefly. I was able to interview Mr. Hom, who was not born and raised in the Chinatown area specifically, and I was able to support interviews with narrators who were born and raised in Chinatown. And I felt that one of the main differences was, I think that in Chinatown, especially in old Chinatown, with families who had more roots there was more of an emphasis on the associations and more of like family gatherings. And something that my narrator, Mr. Hom, mentioned was he felt that he wasn't able to get as much Chinese culture growing up, and he went to Los Angeles High, for example. So I feel like he was exposed to a more diverse population over there rather than those narrators who might have gone to local schools around the Chinatown area.
Thank you, Yushin. We have a few other questions, general questions about the project. So I'll ask a few of those, and maybe I'll let either Dr. Fong or Dr. Quintana jump in and answer some of them. One question we have is, can you explain to us how each intern chose their specific interviewee?
I answered that in the chats, but just to give you some background is this is actually the second year that we've run the summer internship, again with the support of folks in the community. And Will especially has really deep relationships with community members, in part because of working on other projects with CHSCC, including Chinatown Remembered. And so as a team, Issa, Will, and I did a lot of planning to get this in place, right, to get the internship running, met weekly. And so we actually did the work finding narrators and then pairing narrators with interns. We also had the challenge of the pandemic, right? So last year our internship was entirely virtual. This year we actually ended up running a sort of a hybrid thing because some narrators wanted to be interviewed in person because they weren't comfortable on Zoom. And so we, managed to pair folks depending on if they were local. As you saw, our interns are coming from across the country, right? So some people could only do interviews on Zoom. Some people, we were fortunate, were local to Los Angeles and actually could meet with narrators in person, but we did that work.
Thank you, Dr. Fong. So a question for the interns now. Can you tell the audience how you trained to conduct these interviews. What type of training did you go through before conducting these interviews? And I'll open it up. Ideally, if there's anyone who hasn't, any of our interns who haven't had a chance to answer one of the questions yet, I'd love to hear from one of you.
Yeah, I can go first. So we were able to look into previous transcripts of interviews from the Chinatown Remembered project, and we had practice clearing those transcripts and being able to see what kind of conversations previous narrators and interviewers had and what kind of background information we should look into. And we were able to read Linking Our Lives, which provides some context. And another way that we prepared for our interviews was that we actually conducted mini interviews with each other to simulate that interaction as well.
Anyone else want to say something that you on the training, just your firsthand impressions of the training?
Yeah, I can add in that I think something that was really helpful in terms of training for the interviews was just talking with my fellow interns about what kind of questions we might ask, and we all just like brainstorm together, and especially doing the mini interview with our fellow interns was very helpful.
A question on photos from Susan Dixon. Can interns talk about the type of photos you encountered in doing this work, and what did you think about them? I'm curious what type of photo collections you encountered, and then tell the audience a little bit about what's going to happen with those photos, the ways in which you supported the archiving of these photos. So anyone out there, I know there were a few of you that that encountered photos that got donated to the society. So anyone want to talk about the photo collections you encountered? V, you encountered a few, right?
Yes, I think Kalani was trying to say.
Sorry, Kaylani, go ahead first. Go first.
No worries. Yeah, so my narrator, Miss Joanne Young, she actually had not even quite a few. She donated over 50 photos for the project, and it was really cool. I was able to interview her in person, and she actually brought like all of these photos and even like scans of like historical documents with her to the interview, because she's done a bit of like her own like family research on her own. And during my interviews with her, it was great because she was able to like, bring up the photos and connect it to like what we were talking about in our interviews as well. As for like the, what's it called? The next steps for those. So my supporting intern, sorry, I'm tripping up on my words, but Stephanie, who supported me during like my first interview, we both like scanned all of them and uploaded to like the drive that we have for the project. As for like how it will be accessed, I'm not too sure about that, but maybe if one of the mentors.
I can speak to some of that for sure. V, did you want to say a few things, and I'll add a little bit.
Yes, definitely. So I believe every interviewee shared a headshot that will go along with like a mini edited transcript that will be on the website. The picture is of their youth, so that will put like a face to a name. But outside of that, two of my narrators were gracious enough to share lots of photo albums with me that we were able to scan as well, just to show pictures of them interacting with schoolmates at the wishing wells of Chinatown, of groceries and businesses in Chinatown as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just add on to this, right? So when you think about this project, right, we have a number of different goals here. One of them is certainly to document the oral histories themselves, and all these interviews have been recorded. They've been transcribed, and they're being placed in the transcribed, checked by the narrators, and then donated to the Society archives, where they're going to be drawn upon in the writing of our book and in the publication, our 5 Chinatowns book, which is coming out from UCLA, as Dr. Katana mentioned earlier on, and then also on a website, which we're going to develop. Along with that, right, we had this desire to incorporate and to document and archive as many photos as possible. And so whenever interns encountered photos, we encouraged them to ask their narrators if they didn't mind donating digital copies, right? The beautiful thing about digital technology now is that people can donate oral histories and they can donate photos, and they don't have to really give up anything, right? These photos were scanned and given right back to the narrator, so they stay in the narrator's possessions. But then they also go into our archives for the use of future researchers. So when we think about this project, right, our project has a number of different steps to it. One of the steps is certainly training interns, college and high school age interns, on the importance of oral history and how to conduct oral histories. A second important part of this, right, is creating an archive which will be open to the community at the completion of this project, so that people in the community, like yourselves out there in the audience, can come to the society and listen to the interviews and look at the photos which we've archived. And then finally, putting together a website and a book to tell this story more broadly, right? Because I think our interns did a very good job of kind of pointing out the ways in which too often Chinese American history, when it's told, is told in such a way that it marginalizes the lived experiences of the people that went through it. And so our hope is that our book project and accompanying website will kind of give a type of life and humanity to those stories. And so that folks can then look at that, and then if they want to find out more, they can come to the society and look at the archives. So yeah, we've got a few more questions out there. We did have a question about the interview pool. We had an incredibly talented interview pool. And Eric noted that there were no male interviewers, so no male interns. We went through, we definitely had male applicants, but we ended up selecting the strongest applicants that we felt in the pool, giving priority to former training in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, and interest in history and oral history. And so that's just the way this worked out. I will say that in our past internships, we have had a number of men that have been interviewers, right? So the Chinatown Remember Project, which was run in a very similar type of fashion, had a number of folks, the college interns that were male. So it happened this way that our strongest applicants this time were all women. Okay, on that note, I just wanted to thank all of the folks out there in the audience, and just kind of say my thanks as one of the project directors to all of our interns. It's really been an incredible experience for me to work with such a talented group of people. We had, as I was just mentioning, a very competitive internship pool, and I was just continually impressed every single week with the type of work that our interns did. And it's because of their work that we're going to be able to put together this publication, and we've been able to build these archives. So I really thank all the interns out there who have spent their summer doing this work. And for all of you in the audience, right, there are a number of ways that we have for you to get involved. This project only really happens with the support of people like you. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fong, who's going to explain explicitly ways that you can support if you're interested in supporting the work of the CHSSC as we move forward to complete this project and into the future. Dr. Fong.
Thanks so much. And just to reiterate everything that's been said, you know, it was a great pleasure to work with all the interns this summer. I think we learned so much from you, right? And what you were getting from the narrators, and it's going to be so integral to our project. So for those of you in the audience who are thinking, you know, this is really inspiring, right? What can I do to support, right? We actually have a number of different ways to get involved to continue supporting our project. So first is become a member of CHSSC, right? If you aren't already a member, please do consider joining. It's really easy. You can go to the website, join a member. You get a copy of the Gumsan Journal, right, which is the annual publication that comes out every year. And of course, you're benefiting, or you're supporting, right, the ongoing work of the Historical Society, including projects like this. Second, consider being an oral history narrator, right? We could not have run this internship, and these interns could not have gained this experience in doing oral histories without the support of community elders who are willing to share their stories, right? And so being a narrator is absolutely key, right, to this project, to training the next generation of, you know, historians, right? And so if you have memories of any of the LA Chinatowns before 1965, please consider sitting down for an oral history and reach out to us, okay? And we'll have our contact information on the next slide. Consider sharing your family archives as we're documenting this, period of LA Chinatown before 1965. As Dr. Gao just talked about, and as our intern just discussed, you're able to keep the physical copies of your treasured photographs, letters, so on and so forth. But please consider sharing the digital version with us, right? And this, if this is something that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. So again, if you have photographs, right, of your family in any of the LA Chinatowns for 1965 and you're willing to share, please let us know. The other thing that you can do if you are able is to consider donating directly to the 5 Chinatowns project. Again, a special thanks to those of you who have donated to this project over the last 2+ years that we've been working on this. I also do want to let you know that our interns our cohort of interns this summer was made possible by a donation by Winston and Joanne Young, as well as an anonymous donor, and of course, V's internship with the Stanley Kwok Lau and the Dora Wong Lau Endowment through the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. So without that support, we would not have been able to run a cohort of 9 amazing interns. So we are actually hoping to complete the book manuscript by next summer, and then again, finish those publication, research and publication activities, and we're hoping to raise another $10,000 to complete the project for a few different things. So building upon our work from the past 2 summers, we want to continue having interns to be a part of this project, who will gain skills in oral history, community-based research, and of course become grounded in the Los Angeles Chinese American community, and of course CHSSC. So in addition to doing this work, right, they're going to help with the publication of the book, including possibly writing chapters. So we're hoping in the next year to have 3 paid internships. And so if you're able, consider sponsoring an intern, right? And that would be about $3,000 for a 3-month internship, okay? In addition to that, we're hoping to also raise additional $1,000 for research and publication costs. Some of you mentioned earlier in the chats that it would have been really great to have a map, right, to go when Dr. Quintana is talking about the 5 Chinatowns. And this is actually something that we do want to have and be able to, create, right, to go with the 5 Chinatowns books, right? So again, thinking about creating maps and tables, licensing for images that CHSSC does not own, you name it. So again, if this is something that you are feeling inspired by and want to support in any way possible, this is a range of possible options. And if you're looking to donate specifically to the project, you can do so by making a donation to CHSSC earmarked for the 5 Chinatowns project. So again, this is something that we could not do without the support of CHSSC and of very generous donors. And of course, our narrators, people are donating archives, and our interns themselves. And so in many ways, this is very much a collective effort, and we could not done it without each and every one of you. So let me just wrap up. Again, a special shout out and thanks again to our donors who made this internship possible, right? So that I already mentioned, Winston and Joanne Young, an anonymous donor who wants to remain anonymous, and of course, the Stanley Kwok Lau and Dora Wong Lau internship. And if you want to get in touch or have more information or want to be a narrator, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our email addresses are below. We will be getting the website up for the 5 Chinatowns project on the CHSSC website, which is at chssc.org. And yeah, thank you so much for attending today, and thank you so much to our interns. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jean for closing out.
Thank you, Kelly. And this is the time where I ask everybody to stand up and give a standing ovation to all of our terrific speakers and presenters and our coordinators. This is an amazing piece of work. It shows your level of preparation, your level of research, all the stories that you were able to coax out of your interviewees. I'm sort of an intern myself, even though I've been a member of the Historical Society for almost 50 years. But it was great to hear from Sonia that Kathy Seppi made a comment about her brothers not washing dishes. So I'm going to use that to blackmail her brothers who are my friends, but it's always wonderful to really hear the human aspects of our community. It's not about numbers or ciphers or you know, how many workers were there doing this and how many doing that. But really, it was about the very real human stories of how individuals overcame adversity, overcame obstacles, or maybe they didn't face obstacles and just went ahead and succeeded on their own. So this is what the value of this history collection process is about. It's really to understand the successes and the challenges that the community faced. By looking back, we can see our path forward. So all of us are interns, and I want to express our appreciation to our audience too, really, for listening, because really with your interests, that's what really drives our efforts, our work to continue. I see in the audience, you know, we have many friends who are local, but I see people who are from Vermont, JW, I see you out there. Laura from Iowa, Carrie from Seattle, Stephen from Pennsylvania, Tom from Santa Cruz, Victor from Wisconsin, Chloe from Chicago, Angela from Portland, and Donna from West LA, which is not that far, but it's like halfway across the continent for some of us. That's a joke, friends. But seriously, it really takes a whole community to really tell this history. And there are so many holes and so many details to be filled in. This past Sunday, Spencer brought in a big box full of photos and shared some of his connections with the East Adams neighborhood. And I'll get some of those to you fairly soon. So it's really dependent, all of this history is dependent upon the contributions of all of you. So on behalf of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, I'd like to thank everyone, presenters, researchers, scholars, community, for joining in and listening to and sharing in our history. I wish you all a cool and comfortable evening. It was 88 here in Alhambra today. And I wish you all the best for the days and weeks and months and weeks ahead. Thank you, and have a good evening.